Hello, everyone, and welcome to Borderlands Open School. It is a pleasure to see you all today as we present the webinar, The Philosophical Story Around the World, brought to you by Professor Saul Morson from Northwestern University. Professor Morson's research interests include the theory of literature, especially that of narrative, history of ideas in Russia and in Europe, and the history of literary genres, especially satire, utopia, and the novel. He also pays much attention to the works of his favorite writers such as Chekhov, Gogol, and the baffled Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. Professor Morson wrote over 20 books on philosophy, world literature, Russian literature, and the economic approach to humanities. His latest book, Mind's Wide Shut, published in 2021, argues for the renewed spirit of dialogue to be introduced in humanities and in the relations between people all over the world. This webinar today will run for about 14 minutes, and after that we'll have 10 or 15 minutes for questions. We've got the chat and the Q&A section, both of which should be available by pressing buttons in the lower part of your screen, so you're welcome to use both. And we also have a live broadcast on Facebook where you can leave your comments for Professor Morson to react to. This is also an introductory lecture, which will be followed by 4 more meetings in June over 4 weeks with Professor Morson, but those meetings will only be available on enrollment basis. So if you like this lecture and you wish to enroll, please visit our website, www.borderlandsopenschool.org, and sign up for the full course. You will receive a 15% discount if you use the promo code EARLY. I'll just drop the address of the website and of our Facebook page here in the chat a bit later. And now I'll pass the microphone to Professor Morson. You're very welcome.
Well, thank you, Katerina. It's still strange for me to lecture and from Zoom because I'm so used to lecturing in person, but in the last year, it has become reasonably frequent. What I want to talk about in this series of lectures is a problem very close to my heart, the relation of philosophy to literature. I read literature for wisdom, to understand life better, moral questions better, in the way that the great Russian writers and almost all great writers do. And since one could be doing this with long novels, but then one would do very few, I've decided to do this on a very specific literary genre, the philosophical story. These are short works that pose philosophical questions. They have existed in, so far as I know, every culture in the history of the world. They're the foundation of religions and epics and philosophies that introduce the basic problems of life because essentially all cultures have to have them. And they have to address those questions. Sometimes we feel that we are too sophisticated to address them directly, but then moments come in life when all of a sudden they seem very pressing. And then stories like these will be important. They will focus the questions, make us understand exactly what's at issue in a very few words. So that's the advantage of looking at these questions through this lens. So today, I wanted to introduce the form by talking about, well, some of the different ways it can work. One way in which these forms can work is it tells the story of how a wise person solves a problem. And in doing so, shows something about the nature of wisdom. In the biblical tradition, the figure of Solomon is often associated with wisdom. If you remember the story, when he becomes King David's successor, he has a dream in which God offers him whatever he would like, and he chooses an understanding heart, that is wisdom. And God is so impressed that he didn't ask for wealth or long life or any of the other things one might ask for, that God gives him those things too. And then if you remember that he is traditionally the author of the various forms of wisdom literature that are in the Bible. For example, the Book of Proverbs. Proverbs were thought of in the ancient world as the distillation of human experience, the wisdom that was passed on in compact form for generations. Egypt was thought of as the place that, being such an old culture, had so many proverbs, and that's why there's a reference to Solomon knowing all the wisdom of Egypt. And in this, one of the stories that are told, one of them appears directly in the Bible, and the others in the literature that surrounds the Bible, sometimes called, apocrypha, some in the Hebrew tradition called midrash. Many kinds of legends that surround the Bible tell more stories of this sort. And the most famous one deals with how Solomon solves a problem. And if you remember that the problem is there are two women who claim that a certain baby is theirs. One of them they both have had babies. One of them has rolled over and sort of covered the baby, accidentally murdered in the night. And the other one supposedly has replaced, she has taken the other one's baby to replace hers, or so she says. But so it's not clear whose the baby belongs to. And they come before Solomon, who was supposed to be so wise as to solve the problem. Now, how would one solve a problem like this? How can you tell who is telling the truth? Well, you can't do it directly. So what Solomon decides to do in this story is he pretends to be applying the Hebrew law about contested property. If you can't tell to whom property belongs to, you divide it. So otherwise, if you can tell, of course, you give it to one, but if you can't, you divide it. So he says, take a sword and divide the baby. Well, one of the women bursts in and says, no, don't do that. I'd rather the other woman had the baby than that you kill it by dividing. And that's how Solomon knows who the real mother is, the one who would rather give up the baby than let it die. So that's considered, one of the great stories of how the wise man solves a problem. There are many, many versions of this, because elsewhere in the biblical account, it tells of the Queen of Sheba coming to visit Solomon, and legend has it that she tests him many times too. So there are more stories, and there can be endless stories, because people who have wisdom stories to communicate will naturally try to ascribe it to the great person. That sort of thing happens all the time. If you have a great story of a witticism, so you will ascribe it to a famous wit, whether it happened to or not. George Bernard Shaw, Oscar Wilde, sometimes Winston Churchill. They're famous wits. So all these stories accumulate around them because they are the appropriate person to deliver a witticism. And in the same way, stories come around Solomon, in other traditions around the Buddha, because they're appropriate. And some of them, one of them, for example, tells how the Queen of Sheba tests Solomon by presenting to him a group of young boys and girls dressed similarly so that they look, you can't tell which is a boy and which is a girl, and asks him to decide. And he decides, what he does is, and there are various versions of this, but in one of them, for example, he tosses something, into the lap of each of them. And the girls spread their legs wide so the skirt catches it, and the boys put their legs together, and that's how he tells. In other versions, he has them wash their face, and the boys wash it vigorously and the girls wash it gently. You can see how this sort of thing works. Without asking them, he does it. There's yet another version about the test is he's presented with two flowers in a pot. Which is the real one? And one of them is a perfect imitation. Which is which? And he stares, and they look identical. He can't tell. And then he has an idea. He opens the window and lets a bee come in. And the bee stops at the artificial flower for a split second, immediately gets up, and then spends his time at the real one. The bee can tell the difference. You see, the version of this was that he is wise enough to know when his own wisdom is insufficient and who or what to go to for it. All these stories are about how the wise person solves a problem, right? Now, in many of the stories, the wise person does it by reason, by sheer rationality, and in others, reason is insufficient. So in the modern world, the idea that reason is sufficient to solve all problems, that was an idea that came in, as a wake of the age of reason, the age of science, the idea that logical deduction plus empirical evidence, well handled, can solve any problem. That was the faith of science. And if you see, that is what's written into the modern detective story. If you think of Sherlock Holmes, who knows empirically all the muds of London or all these facts, and then can reason directly from them, all the stories deal with that. You understand? They're about sheer rationality, having the capacity to solve all problems. So it's kind of basic social science with the pure faith in social science. That's a version of the story of the wise man solving a problem. But in this case, the wise man does it by a scientific rationality. There are other stories in which you see the limits of human reason. They cannot really solve the problem. And what you get is a different kind of answer, which is the deepening of the question. So in the Greek tragedies, there's the story of Oedipus, who's very much a detective. He thinks he can solve all problems by the use of reason. And it turns out that he is blind himself. And therefore, at the end of the play, he has to be blinded literally because there's a greater wisdom that he doesn't see. But in some of the stories, for example, it will take a form of something like this. There's a story, for example, in the Talmud about the well digger's son. The well digger's daughter has fallen into a well and can't get out. And so the people of the town who can't get her out go to the rabbi, who can supposedly the wise person who can solve all problems, and asks what to do. And he says, go back and look again. I go back, no change. Rabbi, no change. Go back and look again. Only, of course, on the third time do they go, and they see that a goat has fallen into the well too, climbed out, and the girl has gotten out on the goat's back. And so at this point, they say to the rabbi, Rabbi, how did you know? And he gives, at first, what seems like the perfect answer. He says, because I could not believe that the Almighty One, blessed be He, would allow a man's child to die by the way he helps others. See, it's a well digger whose daughter has fallen into the well. That can't be, because that's how he helps people. So I knew it wouldn't work out that way. So it looks, see, it's about faith in divine justice is how he solved it. But then, just when you think that you have that, the last line of the story complicates it. It says, nevertheless, the well digger's son died of thirst. See, it's much more complicated than that. Well, many modern stories have tried to use the detective story, which supposedly promises the purely scientific rational solution to the problem, to do a kind of religious wisdom that suggests that human reason is insufficient. If we were doing a novel, I would have you, look at the detective in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. It's the murderer, Raskolnikov, who believes in reason, whereas the detective, Porfiry Petrovich, knows that rationality leads you astray, and he's able to solve it not by rationality, but by empathy and psychological insight, to get inside the head of the person, which is not a rational problem. It's a kind of developed empathy that allows you to project into somebody else. Well, that's what's really involved in G.K. Chesterton's stories. The one I mentioned, for this class, I asked you to look at, if you have the chance, one of the Father Brown stories. G.K. Chesterton wrote many of these stories where the detective is a priest, Father Brown. And his way of solving problems is not the Sherlock Holmes way, but by a deep understanding of the human spirit, which he gets from religion. And what I think is, the story about all the other stories, the one called The Secret of Father Brown, he's there, with one of his friends, when in the next villa, there is an American named Gordon Chase on the adjoining estate who comes to talk to him. And he says, Father Brown, we know how Sherlock Holmes solved problems. We know how this detective problem. They all have their scientific method. What's your method? And he says, well, I have a strictly tabulated scientific method. What's yours? And I don't really have a method. No, you have to have a method. And if you don't give me your method, what's going to happen is these purely mystical people, these, who believes in spirits and from the other world, they're called the Second Sight Sisters of Indianapolis, will say it's supernatural, it's a cult. And that's what we'll get around if you don't give me your method. Well, Father Brown, who is a Catholic, doesn't want that to get around. So that he does believe in the supernatural, or he wouldn't be a Catholic. But he doesn't believe in the superstitious superstition. It's something very specific that you believe in. And in one of the other stories, he has a famous line where he says, the problem with atheists is not that they believe in nothing, but that they're prepared to believe in anything, right? That is, because the spot of belief in the supernatural, in values, is not taken by religion, they're open to any crazy notion, like, presumably has in mind, things like Marxism or some other atheistic ideology that purports to explain everything. Well, he doesn't want the notion of the occult supernatural to get around, so he decides to say how he's able to solve these problems. And he shocks the American by saying, well, the thing is, he says, I was able to solve these problems because I solved the crimes because I committed them myself. What? You couldn't have possibly committed them yourself. Well, no, not in that sense, he says. But you see, what I did was I thought and thought and thought through what would bring someone to commit that crime, and what circumstances would he have to be in to commit it. And when I felt absolutely sure that I had put myself in that person's shoes, and the only thing differentiated me from that person was that I hadn't actually made the decision, but I easily could have. Then, of course, I knew who did it and how. You say what he's suggesting here is not a rational method, but you do what Christians are supposed to do: empathize with somebody else, Put yourself in the position of another person. See the world from a point of view other than your own. Use that, the developed technique of empathy, which is not scientific. And that's how he's able to do it, completely differently. You understand it? And Sherlock Holmes could not do that. He's not empathetic. He viewed people as basically objects of a social science. And though that's why Father Brown then, addresses the problem of relying on science. He says, science is a grand thing when you can get it. But what do many people mean, when they say science nowadays? When they say that detection is a science, they mean getting outside a man as if he were a giant insect. When the scientist talks about a type, he never means himself. So far from being knowledge, it's actually suppression of what we know. It's treating a friend as a stranger. It's the sort of thing that happens if you take your distance from people and say, well, a man falls down in a fit of insensibility once every 24 hours, instead of saying he falls asleep, which is what you know. You treat them as an object, right? But no man's really any good until he knows how bad he is or could be, till he realizes how much right he has to all this snobbery and sneering and talking about criminals as if they were apes in a forest 20,000 miles away, unlike himself. So he's got rid of all this dirty self-deception. The problem with social scientists is that they look upon others as not as subjects like themselves, but as objects. They apply the science to others. They never apply it to themselves. They ask, well, what social conditions make you think that? They never apply to themselves the notion, gee, what social conditions have made me think that I can know other people like that? They don't ask that. They apply it to others. But it's viewing people as objects, which is the prime error. You need to view them as other subjects before you can understand them. Again, this is the opposite of the Sherlock Holmes type of story, right? Now, and another one of the stories I mentioned was a one-page, I think, absolutely brilliant story by Voltaire. Voltaire wrote a lot of philosophical stories posing these problems, ranging in length, like this one, from a page up to maybe 100 pages of his great novella Candide, and everything in between, all posing philosophical questions. This one I particularly love because it's about a problem that is still very much with us. And it is, so many people will say, well, the purpose of life, what we all live for, is happiness. We maximize our pleasure, we minimize our pain. That's sort of the way, utilitarianism, economics argues we are. And many people think it's just common sense. What else could you be in life for? But happiness, right? That was a common notion in the 18th century, where it was a kind of a new idea, that began, because, before, let's say, the 17th century, if you'd ask people what is the purpose of life, they would not have said happiness. They would have said, not how do I be happy? They would have said the question is, how can I be saved? How can I do what God wants so I achieve, salvation, immortal life, please God? Happiness would not have been the point. But with the secularization of the West, it seemed that the only possible answer was happiness. Not everybody thought this, for example. The philosopher Immanuel Kant certainly thought this was not the case. He thought that happiness might go against our duty, which is to follow the moral law. Now, he wasn't appealing to God for it. He thought there was an objective moral law, and that's our prime reason to do it. But the other view seems to have dominated. People just take for granted that what else could life be about? What else could you want than happiness? Well, then think of the problem, the problem that Voltaire poses. In the story of a good Brahmin, there's this wise, wealthy, educated Brahmin living in a castle who has everything he could want, and he's miserable. And he notices that outside his castle, there's an old, stupid beggar woman who sits there and is happy. And he asks himself, would I change places with her? Would I become stupid, for instance, if that would make me happy? And I realized I wouldn't. But that's strange, he says, because what's the purpose of all my intelligence if not to make me happy? What other purpose could it be? But then, why wouldn't I give it up to be happy if that's its only purpose? And the narrator of the story says, you know, I was so impressed by the Brahmin saying this that I've asked other people. And I've never found anybody who would become stupid in order to become happy. But that's strange, because if you even pause for a second, it means you're not sure that happiness is the goal, that there might be something else. Because if you were certain, not just that you would choose to be stupid, you wouldn't hesitate for a split second because there'd be nothing else to do. The fact that we at least hesitate, and almost nobody actually will make that choice, suggests that happiness is not the main or only goal of existence. But then, what is? And how do we, if it's, isn't that a way to happiness too, whatever it is? And yet I wouldn't give up for that. How do we solve this problem? And the story ends with saying, we don't solve it. Like many other things, it's a question that we keep looking for an answer for, but do not find. That is, the search for an answer is the best we do. We get wiser by asking the question because we deepen our understanding of the issue. But unlike the stories of, let's say, Solomon or Sherlock Holmes, we do not find an answer in that sense, a single answer. We find wisdom consists in a deepening of an understanding of the question. The last story I mentioned was this very complicated one. If you haven't read it, it would take me too long to summarize all of it, but it's a story by the great 20th century, the greatest 20th century author of philosophical stories, the Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Portface. You know, it was a wonderful collection of his stories with the title Labyrinths. And they all are like this. They don't answer questions. They deepen our understanding of them. And in the particular story here, the one called The Garden of the Forking Paths, it's a double story. In the outer story, it's a typical detective story. It seems that there is this unexplained why this Chinese person who is working in England as a spy for the Germans during the war, and the problem is he needs to get a message to the Germans that they will understand over the din of war, but that the British will not be able to decipher, but his masters in Germany will. We don't know what the message is yet. So what he does is, we see that he's being pursued by the British agent who is going to capture any moment. He looks in the phone book and decides to take a train, for some reason we are not sure, to a certain station where he gets out and proceeds to the home of a man named Stephen Albert, who just happens to be an expert in Chinese culture, and indeed happens to have solved a mystery relating to the hero's ancestor. And we get that. I'll go back to it in a minute, what the problem was and how he solved it relating to his ancestor. And then the hero, as soon as Albert turns his back, shoots him and kills him. And at that moment, the British agent comes and arrests him. And the story is being written from his prison cell. This is the point that we're told, that we learn that the reason he did it is that he wanted to communicate to the Germans the name of the town the British were going to bomb. It was the town of Albert in France. And so he did it for no reason, shooting a man named Albert, which would signal to the Germans there was no reason for it. It would get in the newspaper the name of the French town. Along the way, he's trying to think of philosophical problems himself. He tries to say to himself, how do I get myself to do something absolutely horrendous like shoot somebody? You say, well, a man who's about to commit an atrocious deed should imagine that it has already happened. And then he'll be able to do it. You need to impose upon yourself the sense of inevitability that you have no choice. And then you'll be able to do it. But there's a problem there, isn't it? Because if you are choosing to impose inevitability, then it's not inevitable. How do you choose fate? Do you understand the problem with this? All these problems sort of begin to accumulate, you see, in the outer story. The inner story is even more complicated. In the inner story, Albert talks about the ancestor of Yuzun, a man named Suken, who left a strange will saying, I leave to future generations, not all, my novel and my labyrinth, my garden of forking paths. But nothing was ever found except a strange, unfinished novel. Unfinished, you know, because in one chapter, hero makes a choice, and then it seems out the next chapter, he makes the other choice. And it goes on like that. It's just bifurcating, but it seems like it's unfinished. But what Albert has realized is that the labyrinth and the novel are the same thing, and that they are models of how he understood time. And he understood time as whenever we have to make a choice, the universe splits. Both choices are made, but in a different universe. And so the universe keeps bifurcating. Understand? In every universe, all possibilities will be exhausted in the sum total of the universes. Now, there's something very strange about this. You understand? Because human choice matters. Freedom matters. Only in a world where there are more possibilities than actualities. You understand that if, for a determinist, you understand there's the same number. There's only one thing can happen at a given moment. So the number of possibilities at every moment is one, given by the laws of nature, and the number of actualities is one. That's why human choice doesn't choose anything. It's already from the first day of creation, you know what the last day of creation will have. It's all calculable. So choice loses its meaning. Choice has meaning only if more than one thing could happen in a moment. One does, but the others don't. More possibilities than actualities. That's how choice has meaning. If it's singular, it doesn't. Now, what's happened, you see, in this model of time is that you get the same problem of determinism by a strange new route. Once again, there are the same numbers of possibilities and actualities, but not because there are one, but because there are many all possible. There are many possibilities, but they're all realized in different universes. So once again, do your choices matter? If you choose, let's say, to kill somebody in one universe, let's say you refrain from killing him, doesn't matter, you've killed him in another universe. You might be able to choose which universe the murder takes place, but you can't prevent the murder. It's going to happen somewhere. So then, none of our choices change the total good or evil in the universe of universes, just in a particular one. So we're back to choice being meaningless again, but by a strange new route. Now, is this problem solved? The nature of choice? Is the problems in the outer story solved? None of them are solved. And isn't it strange that the very, very person who matters most to the narrator, to the hero, is the one he has to kill? It seems like a strange coincidence. It's a mystery. And that's how it remains in the story. You understand, you have a sense of the enormous mysteries of time without solution. Once again, all the great problems are raised. You understand them much more deeply, as in the Voltaire story. And that's the best you can do. Wisdom consists in understanding the world and its questions better, but you must never think you will find the definitive answer. You will get smarter and smarter. You can get wiser and wiser, but not by finding a given answer, but by understanding the issues deeper and deeper. So those are the two types of stories. The one where wisdom story, where you have the answer. And this appeals to the scientific spirit, or nowadays to the social scientific spirit. Well, we know the right thing to do because social science tells us. And the other one, the sense that you get in most great literature, that the world is so complicated that only by simplifying it can you think that there can be such a thing as a hard social science with definitive answers. The wise person knows the complexity of things. So I will leave it at that here. That's what all these lectures are going to be about. The complication of moral, psychological, social issues, and how the great writers talk about them. If you have questions, I can answer them now. I don't know exactly how these questions get answered. I don't see any here in chat. Does anyone have a way of getting them to me?
The fact is that we don't have any questions yet, but folks, you're very welcome to type them, or you can raise your hand if you feel like that, and I'll give you the permission to speak. Okay, we have one raised hand. Let me see who that is. Yeah.
Hello, thank you very much for this lecture. I have a question regarding Borges' story. At some point, Albert says that in this universe where Yutzin happens to be, Albert is his friend, no. He says, in one of the universes, I'm your enemy, to which the hero replies that, well, I'm your friend, and then kills him. Is there some kind of could this be prompting him to make this choice? Does this hint that that the hero chose to be an enemy in the world which currently was proclaimed as friendly by Albert? I don't know if I formulated it well.
He says, I am grateful to you for what you've done about my ancestor in all times. And Albert says, no, not in all times, because in some of them, you're my friend, and some of them you're my enemy, if you understand your ancestor's theory. And then he turns his back and then he shoots him. Well, he proves that there's at least one universe where they are enemies. So he just shot him. Or maybe, you see, they're not enemies. He shoots him not because he's an enemy, but because of some completely other reason, which in fact is the case. So then he's not an enemy, isn't it? So there must be another universe who's an enemy. You see, it's not clear. And that's part of the point. What makes an enemy becomes the next question, you see. Is it the way you behave or your motivation? And that's left open here too.
All right, we have several questions in the chat now. So one question is, what short stories by Chekhov do you consider wisdom stories? Could you give some examples?
Well, if this series of lectures will be dealing with several of them, and it'll be dealing with the one called Shasya Happiness, In Exile. There's one called Lights, and there's a wonderful one called Student. I mean, there are several. These are ones I particularly love. But I particularly love one called Enemies. But there are others we're not going to do, like The Bet, Ward Number 6. Many of them have some philosophical questions. The one I'm going to do are the ones that concentrate, where people actually ask and argue philosophical questions for most of the story, as they do, for example, as you see in that wonderful story, Lights, where the questions are complicated. And they answer them by not just philosophical answers, but by how you live. Says, look, the reason you shouldn't think this way is, and then he tells a story. He doesn't give a rational argument. He says, if you think this way, you're going to make mistakes in life. I thought this way. These are the mistakes I made. So it's the consequences of thinking away, or the psychology that it leads to, that becomes the problem. That is how you live it rather than how a philosopher would do it. So, but there are many, stories like that.
Right, one other question from the chat. I was wondering where you fall in the intentionalist versus anti-intentionalist debate on interpreting art. And do you think it makes it different on how we understand the philosophy in a piece of literature?
Oh, that's a really interesting and complicated question. The question is usually phrased as, is the meaning of the work the author's intention? And then if it is not, is it in the text itself, regardless of the author's intention? Or is it whatever the reader wants? You see, because in one of those cases, in the first two, if it's the author or the text, you can fix it, you can say what it is. In the other case, you can't. My own view is that, it would take a long time to describe this, is that all these ways of thinking about it have a too simple notion of what an intention is. When an artist, a painter, a writer is making a work, the writer senses that this is a rich, good way of doing it. It is filled with implications. That's the intention, is to fill it with implications, profound implications, raising questions. But it doesn't mean the author can specify, or would even want to specify, all the possible interpretations that grows out of those complications. It may be that they're there for a future generation to raise the other side of the dialogue for. So intentionally, it admits of many answers. Not every answer, not every single one. Doesn't mean whatever you want. But it's more than one answer, and that is part of what the author intends. So it's not so simple as that. You could say, is this interpretation in the spirit of Chekhov's story? Even if he didn't think of it himself, if he had heard us say it now, given our culture, which he couldn't have known about, would he have said, oh, yes, that's possible. That's more like it, you understand? He couldn't have been able to specify it, but if he could have lived, he could have said, yes, that's a possible way. I hadn't thought about that, but it does fit the spirit of the story. That's also an intention. So that's how I would answer the question.
All right, and there is one more question from Yelena. Could what Father Brown is doing be equated with life entering? If so, what is the source of Bakhtin's idea in this respect?
Yes, well, I was just giving you, I'm glad you mentioned Bakhtin, because that theory of intentionality I was giving you was Bakhtin's theory of intentionality. And yes, it's what he's, the live end of Jivanya that Bakhtin thinks of is a form of empathy. You live into another point of view. You get out of yourself and live from another point of view. And yes, that is what Father Brown is talking about. And I think, although Bakhtin can't say this, Chesterton can, they're both thinking of it as a Christian way of thinking. That is, transcending the self to see from another point of view. Of course, you wouldn't have to be a Christian to think that way. You could believe in empathy as, for example, that wonderful, great English novelist, George Eliot, who was, not a believer, but certainly believed in empathy as the prime value. Could. But it could also be a Christian one. It doesn't have to be. But you understand, if you see others simply as social scientific objects, then you don't even understand what that would be, that kind of live empathy or empathy.
Right, and one other question. Do you think that popular genre stories that aim to entertain while also dealing in complex themes can deliver philosophy in the same way that the more literary text addressed today can do?
Well, I would say that if they could, they would be literary texts. The fact that they're popular doesn't mean they're not literary. It's their depth and quality and wisdom that would make them, Shakespeare and Dickens were very popular in their times. It didn't mean they weren't literary. They're not exclusive. It's the depth of thinking and the quality of it that makes it literary. And popular things, of course, could be. They usually aren't, but then most things aren't that wise to begin with, or they'd be too easy. But they certainly could be. Just like you can get wisdom in folk tales, which circulate a great deal.
Okay, I see there's lots of questions coming, but I guess we only have time to take one last question, and we'll address all the others a bit later, maybe in a separate video.
Good.
So the question is from an anonymous participant who is curious about your thoughts on Sherlock Holmes, not as an example of rationality, but as a work of literature. To what extent do you think literary form could offer or not offer wisdom of philosophical questioning?
Wisdom of what questioning?
Wisdom or philosophical questioning.
Well, I mean, that's if the writer picks a form that adapts itself to philosophical questioning, like this form, or as in the novel of ideas, it lends itself to asking these questions. Because you understand, a form is not just like a mold. A literary genre has certain assumptions built into it. For example, if you don't believe that people are psychologically complex, you don't write realist novels because they assume that people are psychologically complex. They want to explore psychology. So psychological complexity will be assumed. And then if you want to test an idea that doesn't presume psychological complexity, it will be immediately clear that the genre and the idea are working at cross purposes, and that will lead to a really interesting confrontation between the two. And that, in fact, is how great philosophical novels tend to work, whether you're talking of Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, George Eliot, not, there's some by Henry James, Balzac. There are many of the Turgenev that do it. And it's usually because psychological complexity is built into the genre, and then it raises a philosophical issue which the philosopher or social scientist has done abstractly and therefore hasn't grasped the psychological complexity. Sort of the way like Sherlock Holmes will appear to Father Brown.
Right, thank you so much everyone who attended this. Please don't forget to subscribe to our Facebook page for more updates on this webinar and on our next events. Professor Morson and the admins are all the time accessible via email, and you can also visit our site, borderlinesopenschool.org, to read the syllabus of the course that will happen in June and to subscribe to it if you have the mind to. We are very looking forward to see you at our next encounters. Thank you, Professor Morson, and have a nice evening, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.